Hello, everybody. It's Jake from Jams and Tea, and today I am doing another one of our tier list videos, but this time I'm doing something a little bit different. In order to prepare for and celebrate the release of the first debut record of Boygenius, The Record, which is coming out relatively soon, or depending on when this video is released, is already out. But viewers of the channel will know that I and my podcast co-hosts are huge fans of Boygenius, the artist collective that consists of Phoebe Bridgers, Lucy Dacus, and Julien Baker. We've chronicled reviews of their releases ever since this channel began, but they had a lot of stuff that came out way before we actually started the podcast. And because of that, and because I am such a big fan, I figured the best way to talk about everything that we haven't gotten a chance to cover, that we probably wouldn't cover in their own dedicated singular episodes in the future, would be to do one of these, a tier lists. And so I'm going to be talking about the main releases from Boygenius, the members, their three solo studio records. Now, some of them have some EPs and side projects. For example, Phoebe has the side project with Connor Oberst, Better Oblivion Community Center. I won't be talking about that, though I will be giving it a passing mention. And the tier list creator thing that I'm using also has Lucy Dacus's debut EP on here, which I'm not going to be talking about. This is just sort of mainline releases that I want to talk about. So without further ado, let's get started. First up, we're going to talk about Lucy Dacus's debut record, which is No Burden, that came out in 2016. And honestly, I don't really have a whole lot to say about this project. Overall, I think it's basically a proof of concept for Lucy as a songwriter more than anything else, as a lot of the production on here is relatively scaled back, even for singer-songwriter stuff. I think that most people would agree that the standout highlight track is the opener on here, which is pretty beloved. I think is one of Lucy's best songs, which I definitely do agree with. I think overall, really, it's a good showcase of her abilities as a songwriter, but what I like about Lucy is that she tends to blend the musicality of her projects with her lyrical content, debatably stronger than the other two members of the Boygenius crew. So here, there's a bit of something missing, I suppose, and it doesn't help that this project is so scant feeling. It's relatively shorter, and I feel like that other projects made by the girls probably wouldn't suffer from this, like the next project that we're going to talk about. So overall, I think that of the mainline studio releases, this is probably the weakest. That said, there is enjoyable songwriting here just because Lucy's sense of humor, her emotionality, it's always on display, and she's always delivering something enjoyable, something you can parse through, and something you can come back to. And I do come back to this every once in a while, but I will admit it's a little bit more difficult than going back to Julian or Phoebe's earlier stuff, as I kind of feel like they were a bit more established right out of the gate with what they wanted to do and what their sound was able to accomplish. Whereas with Lucy, I think that this is sort of the only starter that really feels its growing pains. So while a decent record in its own right, I think that I would have to put this in the C tier. A good record, but for the Boygenius girls, this is probably about as standard as it gets. But right after that, we're talking about Julien Baker's debut record, which is Sprained Ankle. Sprained Ankle, honestly, accomplishes a lot of what I would have wanted out of a debut from Lucy, just because I feel like it takes advantage of its status as being very crudely recorded indie folk songs that Julien is very much leaning into the stripped back presentation of. She's not suffering from a lack of production. She doesn't suffer from the fact that she doesn't have her band behind her like she would on later projects. Everything here feels exactly the way it should be. You can feel Julien channeling a lot of early Elliott Smith. I think that this is perhaps the most analogous to something like Roman Candle, where if you go back and you listen to something like that and you're not put off by the more comparatively back to basics production, or if you find novelty in that, you'll probably find a lot of great novelty here. I think that Julien's knack for songwriting and song construction right out of the gate is really memorable, really fantastic, and overall there are some powerful vocal performances on here. Like on the song that I think is best representative of the album, and maybe Julien's best song overall, it's at least in contention for being her best song, which is Rejoice, which is just contains this brutally powerful vocal performance where she details her struggle with addiction and the way that's impacted her life and the way she tells this story and then just kind of hollers at the end of those verses is like, it sounds legitimately painful. It is difficult to listen to. And honestly, I feel like if this project were a little bit longer, it might actually suffer more because it gets so much good mileage out of its components that I feel like if it stretched itself any more like thinly, then it just wouldn't work as well. Everything about this album feels tightly designed in a way that it is like complementary to how you consume and listen to the music. It's a great record. I have come back to this a lot. I think this might have been my first actual Boygenius record, if memory serves correctly, and I still have a lot of fondness for it today. Overall, I think this is a solid contender for the B tier. And just because this doesn't land in the A or S tier, that doesn't mean I don't think it's good. This is, again, very, very relative, as I think all of these projects are bare minimum very, very good. That being said, let's move forward to 2017's Stranger in the Alps. Now, everybody who knows me knows probably a really big fan of Phoebe, and if you're a fan of the channel, you'll know that we actually did an entire Record Club episode dedicated to this album last year. One of our best record clubs, honestly. I would really, if you want to hear us talk about this album and the songs in more detail, then go watch that. It's a really good episode, and it will keep me from expounding too much on this record, which I love. This is one of the first vinyl I ever bought when I got a record player. And yeah, this is, I think, the album that really cemented my interest in these girls as an artist collective and my interest in Phoebe in general, just because, I mean, yeah, this is one of my favorite records, period, let alone one of my favorite records in this genre. I think Phoebe's songwriting is fantastic, and I think it's the first time where not only does she make good use of the production, but the production itself is like an easy standout highlight. The sort of deep bass tones that are on songs like the opener Smoke Signals, which is just one of the best album openers of all time. There's so much depth and intricacy to these instrumentals, which are very careful, very quiet, very beautiful, and are very complemented by Phoebe's kind of ghostly vocals. But that doesn't mean that this is in one gear. One thing that you may not get along with super duper well with Sprained Ankle is that it is very much kind of in one instrumental mode. And I think that it works. But here, I feel like there's a lot more diversity. When it comes to versatility as a songwriter, I think Phoebe might be the strongest because she can come out with really solid folk pop songs like Motion Sickness, that still get radio play today, which is a fantastic fucking song. But when she wants to go into her more singer-songwritery mode, she does that fearlessly, and she's able to make these two sides of her sort of artistic persona feel like they're not at odds with each other. They feel very natural, and it makes this album that has a lot of diversity within itself still feel like it's anchored to her as a presence. So there is dynamism here, but it's not something that like throws you off. It's not something that feels like it's too scattered, too all over the place. I love this record. It is an amazing album. It does have one or two songs in, I think, the back half that maybe aren't, 10 out of 10 amazing, mind-blowing, blah kind of songs, but that's really the only issue I have with it. And when I need to speak so relatively, it's a bit silly to have to get into the minutia of that so much. This is a great record. I thought about putting it in the S tier, but I can't quite bring myself to do it, not because it's not good enough, but because the ceiling for these girls is just really, really high. It's not quite perfect, but I love it as much as I love any other perfect album. So take that for what it's worth. And in that same year, if you were perhaps wondering at any point why your friend who still reads Pitchfork in 2017 was really sad in the second half of this year, it was probably because they were listening to Julien Baker and Phoebe Bridgers, because I think it was only a month after that where Julien Baker put out her sophomore effort, which is Turn Out the Lights. And this record really, really grows on you. At first, I was like, I definitely thought that this had some great highlights on here. I mean, I was really hyped with the singles that came out for this. I think Appointments is a great song. Overall, when I first listened to it, I thought it was good, but it didn't hit me with that same immediacy that Stranger in the Alps did, and it didn't have the diversity within the production. And I wasn't exactly expecting that. I was just, I think, expecting for Julien to make a bit bigger of a leap when it came to the instrumental qualities. And there's a lot of piano on this, but that said, it's still very stripped back, but there is a bigger, fuller, cleaner sound that's going on here. And it took me a while to sort of fit into its groove a bit more. But what remains the appeal of Turn Out the Lights is the songwriting, which is fantastic. It is as raw, as painful, as emotional as the first album. But here, there's almost a metallic quality to the way she writes. I don't mean in terms of like metal music. I mean in how hard-edged and kind of evocative and kind of tough to swallow some of this lyricism truly is. Like, there are parts on here on songs like Sour Breath, for instance, that just really cut very deeply, detailing not only her past with addiction, with alcoholism, and just her overall, state of continual emotional dependency. This is just a really layered release that each time I came back to, I liked it more and more and more, to the point where I just started listening to it all the time, like 2 years after it came out. It is not maybe the big leap forward that maybe a lot of people wanted it to be, but I still think that fundamentally it's enough of an improvement and overall is a more well-rounded album than Sprained Ankle. Even if it doesn't contain the huge highs, it retains being a more consistently solid album experience to me. While I wouldn't say it's as good as Stranger in the Alps, it's nipping at its heels, in my opinion. It's almost as good. Again, if that sort of dynamism was added to this project, maybe, but as it stands, I would still say that Turn Out the Lights is worthy of being in the A tier. I think it's a solid improvement. I think it's a more robust, more satisfying album that maybe it doesn't have as many singularly show-stopping moments as Sprained Ankle does, and it doesn't have the sort of DIY intimate appeal of the first album, but it trades that for a certain sense of artistic confidence that I really, really enjoy. So after that, we have 2018, the one of two releases on here we'll talk about, which is Lucy Dacus's album Historian. Now, this is the point where I think Lucy finally got to prove that she was just as good as the other two girls. Because, not to say like her debut wasn't good, it absolutely was, but there was little to distinguish her from a lot of her sort of indie musician contemporaries until this. I think that the song on here that most deftly proves that, and that will probably be stood up for by a lot of other, indie music connoisseurs, will be the song Night Shift. A lot of people were talking about this song when it came out. I think this is kind of a bit of an era-defining song for the sort of late 2000s when it comes to this brand of indie music. And it's a terrific song. It's really emblematic of how strong Lucy is, fundamentally speaking. It really does feel like she made a significant effort to showcase her improved skills as a songwriter, but also just how these songs sound is way more satisfying. There's actually a music video that came out semi-recently for this song that was directed by the woman who directed We've All Gone to the World's Fair, I believe, which is a fantastic music video that you should absolutely check out. But Historian really does feel like the proper first moment for Lucy as an artist, where everything kind of aligns, everything feels confident, everything feels assured, and Lucy makes herself known not just from her contemporaries, but in Boygenius. She, I think, is the presence that feels the maybe least world weary, but still contains a very sort of jaded presence. But comparatively speaking, I feel like Julien is the very weathered soul kind of person, and Phoebe very much feels like the distant onlooker of people who are her age, whereas Lucy feels like an active participant in, the game of life in a way that maybe the other two don't always feel. And this perspective is really, really refreshing compared to the other two. And I think that this album also, kind of like Turn Out the Lights, is a bit of a grower. I really didn't think much of it when I first heard it, but now within the context of all of these records, I feel like I appreciate it a hell of a lot more. I really do like it, and I would say that it's absolutely worthy of the B tier. It doesn't quite have the assuredness of what I think her best work contains, but don't worry, we'll get to that. The other release in 2018, which is super notable, is the Boygenius EP, which is the first time all three of them collaborate on a big project. This was the inception for Boygenius as a band, and ever since this was released, people have wanted the record to be released. Finally, we're getting that, but this was the inception, and it's sort of, I remember everyone was talking about this, at least the circles that I ran in, because the notion of these three basically being the next, Crosby, Stills, and Nash was an inevitable comparison. And it works well because of the chemistry. Very much like Crosby, Stills, and Nash, you can feel like the songwriting is a result of three different minds. You can feel the three separate perspectives here, but it doesn't feel like it's being pulled in different directions. It doesn't feel like any one of these three are trying to sort of assert themselves as being the front woman or being the most important voice. It feels like everything here, you can kind of tell when some of them have like more prominent writing credits more than the others, but they usually do a really great balance of making their voices artistically and sonically blend in to create a really unique feeling project, but a project that still feels like it retains the appeal of all three separate artists. And that alone, I think, is a miracle, because despite them inhabiting the same kind of indie rock singer-songwriter world, they all kind of come from the same place. They manage to make their voices feel unique. They manage to combine them in a way that doesn't just make them sound like any other person who is working in this field right now. And for Boygenius, the EP to feel as, assured in that creation. Granted, it is only 6 songs, but those 6 songs are such seamless combinations of what these girls do so beautifully that I just kind of marvel at it. This is one of, if not my favorite EP ever. In fact, I would say that this is the only EP I would ever give perfect marks to. I adore every single song on here. Me and My Dog is an eternal banger. Catch 'em ID is a song that I have listened to endlessly because it is just one of the most effectively poignant songs to listen to when you're in a terrible mood. It's just a perfect vertical slice of the appeal of these three. If you want to get someone into their music, this is how you make them a fan, in my opinion. And that's just, it's sort of the ideal optimization of the EP as a format, is that it gives you everything you want out of the bite-sized album experience. So even though this isn't a full album, I am going to put Boygenius, the EP, in the S tier. I adore all of these songs so much. I've listened to this EP so much that I could only call it my favorite EP. Absolutely terrific. Every song on here is a stone cold fucking classic. Speaking of my favorite things, we have, of course, 2 years later, 2020's Punisher. Again, if you're a fan of the podcast at all, you'll know one of the first reviews we ever did, we talked about Phoebe Bridgers' Punisher. It was one of those records that initially came out and really lit a fire under us collectively for our passion for talking about music because we just had a lot to say, a lot to dig into. This was a big album when it was released for the world of alternative and indie music. And yeah, if you know me, this isn't going to surprise you at all. Punisher is my favorite album, period. No qualifiers. Not only was it my favorite album of 2020, I consider Punisher to be my favorite album ever recorded. I went through an experience emotionally that very much primed me to receive Punisher because it's an album that deals a lot with emotionally dependent relationships, whether that be on an artist, whether that be on someone you love, whether that be on someone who you have a complicated relationship with. This album is all about dealing with levels of different emotional dependency. Sometimes it can be with your family members, like on a song like Kyoto, which is about Phoebe's dad. Sometimes it can be on stuff like Moonsong, which is about a former partner of Phoebe's. Or there are songs on here that also allude to Phoebe's past relationship with one of her drummers. So a lot of the content here very much feels emotionally raw. It feels like it comes from a very, very distinct place of pain and self-examination. I'd say that something that Riley said when we were talking about the album, that this must have been how people felt when Joni Mitchell released Blue, one of the biggest singer-songwriter albums of all time. And I feel like that's a good comparison for it. Punisher very much does feel like our generation's answer to that. And not only did it appeal to me in that sense, is that this was a quintessential quarantine album back when COVID-19 first started up. We were all holed up alone in our houses during lockdown. I feel like Punisher came out at a time that was really poignant for a lot of people because it dealt with isolation a whole lot. And I also think that this is probably the best produced Boygenius album, not by a lot. I'll talk about the title that sort of gives it a run for its money later, but this album really leans into a sort of ambient pop feel that Phoebe mines incredibly well. This is one of the best engineered albums of its kind. It's not something you typically think about when you think about singer-songwriter or indie records, but take one listen to something like Garden Song, the opener, and the depth of the sound here, the sort of murkiness of everything. It feels really like slaved over. Every song has so much detail in it. I've listened to this album literally hundreds of times. I have an embarrassing amount of scrobbles on this on Last FM. And I mean, yeah, it's my favorite album. It's going to be in the S tier at the very top. It is the standard to which all albums like this are held to me. Every song, in my opinion, just hits a chord that I am able to understand on a level that feels like it was written just for me. But as a step forward for Phoebe, it really feels like she pushed herself to the limits of not just what makes her very wry, very witty, occasionally acerbic and self-effacing, very confessional songwriting. It feels like she mined the deepest part of herself at this period in her life and just flawlessly translated it into classic song after classic song. Even the low-key cuts on here, like something like Halloween, I just get so much out of. Everything here, the title track, this is music that soothes, calms my soul. And it also has moments on it like the closer, which really feel like these grand epic moments. For as much as Phoebe channels people like, Joni Mitchell, for example, I feel like she also channels people who are a little bit more ambitious. There's a lot of Sufjan Stevens on this album, the horns on something like Kyoto or I Know the End. It's sort of big operatic finish. It feels like Phoebe was certainly going to assert herself artistically, musically, in every sense of the word. And this is just the quintessential singer-songwriter album of the 2020s so far. For me, for a lot of other people, our album of the year that year. What else can be said? And then in 2021, we have Little Oblivions, Julien Baker. And this is an album that honestly got a really muted reception. I know a lot of people were looking forward to it. The singles for it, I know, got a lot of hype behind them. Stuff like Hardline, which is still one, I think, the best songs that any three of these girls ever put out. And yeah, it came out and people really kind of weren't into it, especially compared to the last couple of projects. Like, you had Punisher, you had Historian, you had Turn Out the Lights, you had Stranger in the Alps, and all of these were just rapturously received by the press, by the public, by everybody. And Little Oblivions is just kind of like people are like, okay, it's fine. And I feel like I was maybe the only person who had a particularly strong reaction to it because I think that there's a lot of thought and a lot of pitch black darkness on this album. It feels like Julien was certainly aiming to do what Phoebe had done on Punisher. And I'm not saying that like she tried to copy her artistically. I'm saying that she aimed to make her definitive record. And she did so by including her backing band a lot. And as a result, the sort of indie rock sound of this is way fuller, way bigger. The organ tones on something like Hardline, for example, the guitars on this are bigger. Everything sounds fuller. And it also sounds just genuinely very well arranged, very well put together, super lively. Like the fact that she made Sprained Ankle, which is a very, very kind of bare bones effort, and then delivers this really sort of excellent full band sound, really show off that Julien might be the most dynamic performer and dynamic artist of these three. And Little Oblivions is a dark album. It's a very dark album that goes in very much into Julien's, feelings on faith, on redemption, on her struggles with addiction. And it feels like these topics have been topics of singular songs and just sort of general emotional states were on Turn Out the Lights. But here it feels almost conceptual. This album seems to operate in like two songs will sort of showcase her sort of depending on, her vices. And then a third song will come around that will be something else that will be a bit more productive or something that's a little bit less toxic, that she maybe a vice that isn't quite as self-destructive as something like alcohol or something like faith. It's something that feels really deeply personal, and it sort of cycles in and out and in and out of these, just sort of getting involved in these coping mechanisms and then bringing yourself out and then getting sucked back in. And as a result, this album has a really compelling push and pull to it. There's not a moment I feel like Julien drops the ball here, but it is a very thorny, very emotionally difficult record to get through. And I don't listen to it quite as often as I do the other projects from the girls, just because it's an album that doesn't really resolve itself, especially on that closer. It just kind of has a lot of loose ends. And I think that's because Julien still hadn't gotten over a lot of what she was struggling with, and that it's communicated in a way that feels deliberately unsatisfying. So on one hand, I kind of understand the muted reception, but on the other hand, I feel like people just didn't really give this album as much of a chance. I still really, really love this record. I think it's really impressive from like a constructive level. I think it may be the most like thoughtfully put together record of all of these, but I can say that its content makes to be difficult listening, shall we say. I would put it very confidently in the A tier, but I still think that Turn Out the Lights is narrowly just a little bit better, just overall, in terms of what albums embody these artists. And last but not least, we have 2021's Home Video, Lucy's album and most recent project released from the girls up until this point. And of course, we also reviewed this on the show. We also reviewed Little Oblivions too. But Home Video was an album that, again, some singles came out. I remember Thumbs. A lot of people were talking about that song. And this album came out, and damn, what a good record. Holy shit. This is the album I had been waiting for Lucy to make, just because I think Historian was great, but I was still waiting for the moment for Lucy to really come into her own. And this feels like it is. When I talked about potentially the best produced Boygenius project, it's either Punisher or this. The GOAT, the modern indie rock producer god, Sean Everett, is behind the sounds on this album, and it makes this experience relentlessly exciting, bright, invigorating. There are lots of choices on here that I never would have guessed that any of the Boygenius girls would have gone for, and a lot of risks are taken here sonically, and basically all of them pan out. Lucy, as a storyteller, is at her strongest here. I could compare a lot of them to not just their contemporaries, but like older singer-songwriters, and that I think that Phoebe has a lot of songwriting commonalities with somebody like Tom Waits. I think that Julien Baker has a lot in common with Leonard Cohen, and I think it's most often easy to to talk about Lucy in comparison to someone like Bob Dylan. But here it feels like this could only have come from her. She certainly does have really good, Dylan-isms in her songwriting, but there's something way more personal and way more, I guess, as a storyteller, she's way more upfront and less kind of mythic than Dylan ever was. And that's, nothing but a strength on here. There's some of the best songs any of these three girls have ever made on here. And as a result, I honestly think this is one of the best albums out of all of these. It has a great arc to it. The closer, Triple Dog Dare, is heartbreaking. It's this beautiful story of young queer love, of Lucy running away with a friend of hers so that they can, escape from the world that feels like it's sort of imprisoning them. And it's just her abilities as a storyteller on here, on songs like Thumbs, where she's trying to comfort a friend who's going through a difficult situation with her father. Lucy talks about, old lovers past, just stories that feel so evocative. You do feel like the home video nature of the album. You feel like you're watching home videos that Lucy made like music videos to or something. You're getting a window into her life through all of these basically like short stories. And it's so compelling and so amazingly performed. In my opinion, this is one of the absolute best. I would say that it is 100% worthy of the S tier. On Sundays, I might even say that I like it as much as even more than the Boygenius EP. This is maybe even also the most underrated project here, as it did get a decent amount of acclaim, but not nearly enough to sort of back up how great the songwriting is on here. And again, this is one of the most interesting and vibrant, sort of upbeat projects they have. There's certainly lots of really sad songs on here, but for the most part, these instrumentals are really kinetic and really fiery and a whole lot of fun. There's just a sense of communion on this album. There are moments where you can hear Lucy and the other people who contribute to the album recording in the studio at the end of some songs, and it's just, there's a warmth that radiates from home video that is exactly what you want when it comes to what you want from like an intimacy level from projects like this, and that's what makes it special. So yeah, these are the records of the three Boygenius girls. We are super excited to review the record when it comes out. Probably going to review that in the first week of April. If that's not already out, keep an eye out for it. And hell, tell me, what's your ranking of the Boygenius projects? What's your favorites? What are your least favorites? Who's your favorite of the three girls? Tell me your opinions. Always great to be talking about great music like this. I'm super excited and can't wait. Hoping that maybe we'll get an announcement for the next Phoebe record within the next year or so. One can only hope. So, of course, rock over London, rock on Chicago. Stevie, do you have a slogan to say? She really likes Phoebe, Julian, and Lucy too. Say bye.